Hello, everyone, and welcome to the big and the small of it, brand growth strategies. We are very excited to be here with you today at Intuit MailChimp's first ever webinar designed specifically for folks in the UK. I'm Greg Shimshinia, Director of Brand Strategy for Intuit MailChimp. Thank you again for joining us today for a panel discussion with our esteemed experts, where we will discuss how small brands can grow and thrive based on a comprehensive report we published titled How to Grow Your Brand, featuring a number of leading marketing experts. During our discussion today, we might also reference some data from the Science of Loyalty and Brand Trust reports that we've also created. You can download full versions of each of those in the Docs tab within Goldcast. And our goal today is to share some practical tips that marketers can use throughout the year to help fuel brand growth. With that, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Les Bennett. Les, great to have you here today.
Hello, great to be here.
And I'd also like to introduce Emily Berryman. Thank you for being here, Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily, Customer Experience Specialist at Strategic, a award-winning and transformation agency in London. We're also MailChimp Pro Partner, so super excited to be here.
And Les, you're pretty famous for your work in the effectiveness space and as a consultant these days.
Yes, well, that's very kind of you to say. I have been working for, I suppose, nearly 40 years in the area of marketing and advertising effectiveness. I'm quite well known for my connection with the DDB network, and these days I work as an independent marketing effectiveness consultant.
Thank you so much again for being here, both of you. We had a wonderful discussion earlier today, and we have a recording of that for you now, after which we'll be back here to answer your questions live. So make sure you're adding any questions that you have for these experts in our Q&A tab. But before we dive in, just a couple of quick housekeeping items for the audience. This session is being recorded for anyone unable to join today, or for those of you that want to refer back to the insights. We'll send an email with a link to the recording following this session, so don't fret if you miss something. You can go back to it later. You can also download the full report through the Docs tab in Goldcast. And as I mentioned, we'll be taking questions from you live at the end of the session, so be sure to submit them via the Q&A tab in Goldcast. We have additional moderators here to help with questions and sort out any technical issues, so please don't hesitate to reach out to them in the chat. And let's roll the tape. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you back here in a bit.
All right, so let's start now with a question that's relevant to all small brands. And Les, I'm looking to you for this one specifically. Regardless of industry or market, why are brands small?
Oh, okay. Well, brands can be small for a number of different reasons. And I think it's important to ask that question because the reason why a brand is small helps you to understand what you should do about it. First of all, there are new brands. All brands start small. Then there are brands that concentrate on one particular niche. So they're kind of limited to a small pool of customers. There are brands that are limited by the size of their category, either because they're local brands or they're national brands, or the category itself has no further limits for growth. There are brands that are small because they're very expensive brands that can only appeal to a part of the market that has a lot of money. And then there are brands that are small because they simply have never fully achieved their potential. And then usually that's to do with an underinvestment of some kind.
And Emily, you're our email and SMS expert. How do you look at those specific channels as tools for helping brands of those types grow?
Yeah, email and SMS, they're really powerful tools to help any business grow, really, especially when they're used together, I think that's when you really reach their maximum potential.
New brands are probably one of the most biggest, or it's probably the biggest category we're talking about today. There are new brands started every day. Many brands are very small for this reason. So, Les, what can new brands do to establish themselves in ways that lead to growth?
Okay, so new brands need to start with thinking about the classic 4 Ps: product, place, price, and promotion. And start with the product. Get the products and services right. If you don't get them right, then everything else is pointless. Great advertising will make a lousy product fail faster. So get your product right. Then think about distribution, think about place. Make it easy to buy the product. Coca-Cola talks about a Coke always being no more than an arm's length away. So make it as easy to find and as easy to buy the product as possible. Then think about price. You've got to pitch your price at an optimum level, not so high that you put people off and don't sell any product, not so low that you have no margins and don't make a profit. There's a science to price optimization. Use it. And only when you've got all those other 3 Ps right should you start to think about the 4th P, which is promotion or marketing communications. If your pricing is wrong, the ROI from your communications will be suboptimal. If you've not got all maximum distribution, you can't get the full benefit from advertising. So the other 3 Ps first, then think about communications.
And Emily, when brands start to think about communication, these new brands, I think that's the most daunting thing for them, because theoretically they are starting at zero, especially with an email or an SMS growth strategy. They have no data. So what other sort of techniques that you recommend to get people to start growing that list and growing up their customer base?
Yeah, it is really daunting, but it's also such an exciting time. When you're a new brand, you're going from nothing, and it's exciting to see those numbers grow. And there's actually so much you can do, and it's really about leaning on the other areas of your marketing mix for that. So, utilizing social media, a brilliant brand awareness tool. How can we generate signups through those channels? But also, one of the first touch points that a user's going to have with you is on your website. So how can you utilize tactics there to drive signups too? So, pop-up forms, when someone's showing a level of intent, we can get them onto the list. And there are so many other great areas, like, showing value proposition and really encouraging people to sign up through different value that they're going to receive from you. Because at the end of the day, no one's going to want to sign up to you if there's not a benefit for them on the other side.
And Les, when we're talking about growing new audiences like this, when we're finally in that promotional P, are there balances to the amount that these new brands should be spending, or just what is a good guideline for how much they should spend, given their revenue and their sales are probably slow to start?
Well, the good news is that small brands, when they first start, don't need to spend so much. What matters is the budget relative to your size and your growth ambitions. A useful metric to think about there is the advertising to sales ratio. Often there's a quoted number for a typical advertising to sales ratio in your category, maybe 2% or 5% of revenue. And you can use that as a benchmark for how much you need to spend to get to a particular sales level. And the good news is also that anything you do will work, because you start off with 0 sales and 0 awareness. So anything you do will increase awareness. Anything you do will increase sales. It's a very easy time to get some traction. And a further piece of good news is, at the beginning, you don't need to focus on emotional brand building quite so much. Just get your name out there, make people aware of your product, and you can go quite performance heavy to start with. So make sure that you show up whenever in the places and at the moments when people have a need for your product, whether that's through SEO, whether it's through paid search, whether it's through point of sale activity, in-store activity, whatever. Just make sure that you appear and it's quite obvious that you're who you are and what you're selling, and things will grow. It becomes more complicated later on.
Yeah,
That's a great
definitely.
way to think about it. I am going to move us on to the next reason that brands are small, though. Even though new brands is a big one, I feel like we could do an entire webinar just on new brands.
Absolutely.
But we've got niche brands as well. So sometimes these are brands that were growing when they were new, and then they've hit a wall, maybe because of that niche. So Les, talk us through why these brands might suddenly stop growing and what they can do to get restarted.
So it's very common, particularly when brands first start off, they think, okay, well, we need to own a niche. We need to find our niche. We need to identify a bunch of people or a product usage occasion that we can just really own. And that is actually not a bad way to get started. If you've got a limited budget, you may not be able to reach everyone in the category, but what you may be able to do is reach a subset of those people. So, for example, if you're selling sneakers, you might go, well, we can be the sneaker brand that is, the one that really people turn to for this particular sport. And that's a great way to get started. But there's a limitation of that, which is that the niche has limited potential. There are only so many customers in that niche, only so many purchase occasions, only so much money. And then what do you do after that? Well, the obvious answer is you grow beyond the niche. Now, while niche marketing is a great way to get started, it's not the route to long-run success. There is a kind of myth in marketing that brands have become profitable by owning niches, by owning a particular group of customers or a particular usage occasion. They don't generally become big that way. By and large, niche brands are actually just small brands, and they're not particularly profitable. So for most companies, niche marketing should just be a stepping stone. You should look to move beyond your niche. So say if you're the sneaker brand for women's netball in the UK, then great. Well, you can maybe move beyond that, move into adjacent categories, basketball, say, or other, or leisure wear, or whatever. Or maybe you could move into adjacent categories. But look for ways of breaking out of the niche. For most brands, niche is just a stepping stone. However, occasionally you'll come across a brand which, by its very nature, is tied to a true niche and can't break out. It's actually quite hard to think of examples, but occasionally it does happen. And if that's the case, then what you need to do is to think about price. Your volume is going to be constrained by being boxed in to the niche. So grow through price rather than volume. And that's a theme I think we're going to come back to again and again over the next few minutes.
Emily, as Les talks about expanding a brand out of a niche, you've built so much credibility and establishment as this niche brand. How do you break out of that and expand with the same kind of, authenticity that you had originally as your list starts to grow, as you expand your audience size? How do you deal with that?
I think it just comes back to, not forgetting where you've come from. So there are going to be people, as you expand, as you grow, as you go into different markets, there's always going to be that group of people that, are from the beginning where you were originally sort of started. So when you are looking to move into different markets, which might be based on, location, it's really important to segment your database, know who is where, ensure that you're, using personalization. So speaking to them with in communications that are relevant to their location, trends that are relevant to their location. And then if you were expanding categories, it's a little bit different. You still really need to leverage that personalization and segmentation side of things, but you can send personalized recommendations based on what they've purchased before, which might be relevant to these new categories that you're moving into. So not just expecting them to move over there, but almost giving them a reason to want to move with you. So in terms of new products, it might be that you really need to share with them the value proposition. Why should these new products that you're moving into, why are they relevant to them, and why should they want to purchase those as well as what they've already purchased before?
And it's worth bearing in mind that these moves are not just communications moves. They may involve thinking about product and pricing and distribution as well. So to go back to the sneaker brand example, imagine that you are, associated with women's netball, and you want to move into basketball. That will probably mean creating some new shoes. And if you wanted to move beyond specialist sports shoes into leisure shoes, again, that would probably involve creating another tier of products. And one would think about pricing at the same time. So, if you look at the sneaker companies, very often they do have specialized products for, say, running, which sell at a different price point from the leisure shoes. So don't just think about it in terms of communications, but think about the other P's as well: product, price, and place. You may, if you move out of your niche, that might have implications for where you sell.
See, now I'm confused because as the only American on the call, I thought netball was basketball. I thought it was a UK slang maybe for basketball, but then you said expand
okay. Well, I know very little about sport, but I do know that they're not the same. So netball is a British sport which is primarily played by women, although I believe that's probably not the case anymore. And it's a bit like basketball, but it's not basketball.
I think we want to talk about small category or small market brands next. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is you're constrained by either your category or your physical location. In some cases, you might be an individual restaurant. So you don't have, you've got a radius of a few miles around your restaurant that limits your ability to grow. So when it's not the actions of the brand that keep it small, how are we, expanding beyond that physical limitation, Les?
This is sort of a bit of a build on, breaking out of the niche, except that here it may be that the constraint is geographical location, in which case probably the first thing is to think about distribution and logistics. So, if you decide that you're a local brand and you want to become a national brand, well, you have to make sure that you can, supply your product to the rest of the nation, distribute your product to the rest of the nation. No point in doing anything about communication until you've done that. As you roll out from local to national, effectively you'll be a new brand in each of those new areas of the country that you move into. So you have to think like a new brand again in those areas. And the same as if you go from, UK to, other countries in Europe or around the world. Again, it's like, think about, do you need to tailor the product at all to local cultural practices or whatever? If you're a service brand, can you actually serve? Have you got restaurants in these new locations? Get the products, get the distribution. Think about pricing. Does pricing need to be different? If you're selling the product you go from the UK to selling it in France, is the price point right? And then think about it like launching a new brand with communications. Moving into adjacent categories is slightly similar, except you may not be starting from zero awareness. So it may be, for example, that say you've launched, you're a well-known confectionery brand, but you move into ice cream. So you've got the brand awareness. You need new ice cream products, and then it's more sort of like announcement type advertising. So again, it's sort of starting initially with communications which simply announce, quite simple, quite functional. You know who we are, but now we do ice cream, sort of thing.
Emily, how might that affect again any sort of communication strategy when you're going into, you have to sort of treat yourself like a new brand again, like Les said, where you're entering these new geographic markets or possibly new categories where you're not known at all. What's sort of the approach from your side there?
Yeah, I suppose it's similar to what I sort of said earlier. So remembering, the original database that you had for, the markets that you were in. And then, like Les said, when you're kind of acting as a new brand in a completely different area, you need to leverage, again, the other areas of your marketing mix to kind of make sure that there's that awareness of you in that area. You're able to build your list, and your communication will really depend on the preferences of that new database, essentially. So the way that you talk to them really depends on their behavior and their interests and things like that. So, collecting as much information as you can sort of at those early stages is really important, and profiling people based on what they tell you and what you can retrieve from like website behavior and things like that will basically help you inform your communication to them going forwards.
Unless you mentioned before that price and well, all of the P's are related, and there's sort of a theme here, like when one is maybe moving, the other has opportunity to move as well. What's the relationship that you see between brand and price here in a small market brand, and how that is another option for growth?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of brand advertising's forgotten superpower, I think. Brand advertising can generate awareness and help you to recruit new customers and help to grow the volume side of the business, but it also changes how much people are willing to pay. When basically people are willing to pay more for the brands that they feel warm towards, the brands they like. The more you build up the emotional relationship between the customer and the brand, the less important price is in the purchase decision, until you get to the point where you get brands that people really love that can charge often ridiculously high prices for the same product. So that's a really important dimension to always consider. And in fact, there's an interesting tension there, that if you're just thinking about growing volume, often the simplest and most obvious way to grow volume is to cut your prices, give people discounts and offers. And that is one of the most powerful ways to get volume. The problem is that affects your margins, it damages your margins, it can actually erode your brand and make your brand look cheap. So the other approach is, let's not prioritize volume, let's focus on revenue and profit, and let's try to keep our margins and our prices healthy and high. So brand advertising can help you to do that.
It's like a moat around your brand almost for...
Absolutely. Yes, Warren
yeah.
Buffett specifically talks about, the pricing moat that makes companies more profitable.
Let's talk about capacity or supply constrained brands now.
So far, we've really talked about expanding the size of the market, expanding the categories you play in, expanding the geography, et cetera, et cetera. But there are times when a brand can't do that because it doesn't have the capacity. And some brands are inherently capacity constrained. So for example, I run a small business, which is basically me, and there is only one of me. So I am kind of capacity constrained. But sometimes there are clever ways of expanding capacity, even when you appear to be constrained. So, for example, I think in the report I talk about musicians. If you go back to medieval times, musicians could only play for a handful of people in a tavern, within earshot. But technology has relentlessly expanded the reach of musicians, starting with musical notation, which meant that composers could publish scores that could be played by other people. The printing press, which meant that those scores could be widely distributed. Recording technology, which meant that you didn't have to be in the same room as people. Streaming, etc., etc. So now Taylor Swift can reach many, many, many more people than a medieval troubadour. So be creative about looking for ways to escape your capacity constraints, whether that means hiring people or, if you like, duplicating yourself somehow through technology. But if you come up against the barrier that there is no further growth, capacity is genuinely constrained, then it comes straight back to price again. Price is the thing that means that demand and supply are in balance. So if you can't sell more, sell it at higher prices.
Your music example there is still perfectly apt too, and to use Taylor Swift as the example continued, like she artists don't make as much money off of streaming these days, so she's touring and she makes a lot of money touring. She's a billionaire because of her tour. It makes a lot of money, but there is only one Taylor Swift to tour, so she can only do so many dates in so many cities, so that explains ticket prices going through the roof.
Absolutely. And I've seen Taylor Swift, fantastic show at Wembley. And I believe when I saw, this was on the Reputation tour, there were 70,000 people in the audience. So there's a technological thing there. All those screens and all the sound systems and all the technology that's used to make a big show from out of basically someone who's a dot in the distance, she's got, increased the capacity that way. But also those tours, I think she seems to be assiduous in recording them and then packaging them up in, documentaries and live streams and recordings and so on. So again, you get more out of those tours. And as you say, ticket prices.
Does MailChimp have the pleasure of breaking the news that Les Binet is a Swiftie?
Amazing.
I think it's old news.
That's amazing. Emily, my question to you is about that sort of price discussion and when capacity constrained brands feel the need to raise pricing. We've done another report, a brand trust report that we released earlier this year, that said over half, 55% of respondents would stay loyal to a brand if those price rises were communicated openly. So how do you, as one of the key tactics to growing a constrained brand in this way, how are you making sure you're communicating those price changes in a way that doesn't cause too much upheaval with your loyal customers?
So before you even start building out your communication strategy for this, I think you really need to take a step back and you need to understand how your customers are going to feel about these increase in prices. From that, you then need to have a look at, okay, well, how do we want them to feel at the end of the day? Because no one likes a price increase, no one likes to spend more. However, they will if they know how it's going to benefit them, how the value that they're going to get. At the end, we need to really put them at the heart of everything. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people would prefer to shop with a brand that, or purchase from a brand that is so open and honest about this, because at the end of the day, that all feeds into the trust element, as you say. And I've seen a lot of brands in my time not even address the price increases. And, people go to social media, it goes into PR about how unhappy people are. And ultimately, it can cause much bigger problems than just being open and honest. You might lose some people. However, at the end of the day, you're going to keep the ones that, are with you for the long haul, essentially. Or, people are going to
appreciate the fact that you are being so open and honest, because everyone at the end of the day also understands that times change, things change, prices might need to increase because other prices on your side have increased also.
The key, thinking about it as an economist, the key metric here is the price elasticity. So in economics, the price elasticity is a measure of how much business you lose as your prices go up. So if you have a price elasticity of -1, then if you put your prices up by 1%, your volume will get down by 1%. And in fact, your revenue will be unchanged. And this is the metric that you're trying to influence here with brand building. You want people to, if you put prices up, you will always lose some customers. You can't do anything about that. But the point is to mitigate it so that you don't lose too many. And if you get your price elasticity down so that it's a small number, then as you put your prices up, your revenue will go up, even if your volume goes down a little.
Moving on to expensive brands or luxury brands, I'd love to make sure we cover that. Sort of a subset of the niche brand, right? Because you're in a very special case of whether it's the fashion industry or travel. You're niching down to a more luxurious experience or a more premium experience. So how are these brands, they're sort of purposely meant to be exclusive to the masses. So how are you supposed to grow a brand like that, Les?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the flip side. This is kind of what success looks like if you've pursued a premium price strategy. Yeah, you've got nice high prices and nice fat margins, but you're constrained to a relatively small group of affluent customers. I think it's important to first of all say that that's not necessarily the constraint that it might appear to be. It might not feel like it, but the world is getting richer. The world has, got unbelievably richer during my lifetime, and we live in a world where even people on quite ordinary, medium, average incomes or modest incomes can afford luxury items sometimes. So if you look at, for example, champagne brands that are expensive champagne brands, some of their sales go to people who are not particularly rich, but they are, they will buy maybe one bottle of champagne a year on when it's a special occasion. So, so there may be areas where premium brands can move beyond the most affluent customers if they pursue broad reach market advertising strategies. The other thing is that even if you take, for example, a high couture fashion brand that really is outside of the budget of an ordinary person, there may be opportunities to sell to that person by having a tiered product strategy. So you get this in fashion where, a fashion designer will move in from being, small and couture and very expensive and winning awards and being, the darling of the fashion industry, to going from couture to sort of ready to wear into diffusion by having a sort of a series of tiers of, if you like, product quality and service, from the most expensive, highest quality down to lower price ranges and more affordably made. So this tiered product strategy can be one way in which premium brands can expand, but it has to be done really carefully, because if you need to have clear differentiators between the different tiers, and you have to do it without pissing off the people who bought the top tier products. It's a very delicate balancing act, but I think in in the report, I talk about Johnny Walker whiskey as an example of they have some ridiculous number of product SKUs. Was it something like 1,500 or something like that?
It's
I haven't
very high,
got.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I researched this, there's obviously this sort of red label, black label, green label, blue label, but there are many other levels at Johnny Walker, including one that goes up to some ridiculously priced whiskey which you can only buy in Singapore, and which you basically have to be a billionaire to buy. So they've done this extremely well. In fact, I think they've done the opposite approach, and they've gone from standard whiskey to launching more and more premium tiers, but one
Right.
can do it the other way as well.
I feel like there's also opportunity for brands like that, especially you see it in fashion a lot, to grow with partnerships with other brands. They'll partner. You'll see a high-end brand partner with sort of a more mainstream brand for a specialty kind of product, or you'll see the same sort of similar to a tiered pricing model where a high-end fashion brand known for making luggage and big premium handbags might release a clutch or a small makeup case or something like that can allow itself to just be more mainstream and available.
Yeah, it might be high quality, but it's inherently a smaller ticket item. So
Right.
I believe, for example, Prada make a lot of their money from small items, like key rings and belts and stuff like that. They're still high quality, but they're at a price point that people can afford to buy into the brand. I believe Harrods, the department store in London, which is premium department store, I've heard a story that they make a lot of their money from simply the shopping bags. So people go there and they go, the only thing I can afford is a shopping bag, but it says, I've been to Harrods, and they make a significant amount of money just from that.
And Emily, if you're a luxury brand that's creating sort of this diffusion brand or secondary line created explicitly to be more of a mainstream price or availability, is there a way you're thinking about different strategies for those different consumer groups that you've created, without losing your sort of luxury appeal to the people who might be your most important customers?
Yeah, I think it feeds off very much of what Les said around, you know, speaking to them very differently and making sure that it's clear that they are different, although they might come from one sort of parent company or one company. The diffusion brand is almost like an attachment of, but a very separate entity. So with the luxury brands, it's really important to sort of create, that sort of exclusivity and making sure people feel part of a group, but not a group that everyone can be a part of. So, having behind the scenes looks, having exclusive content that no one else can see. But then the diffusion brand is a lot more welcoming, more of that sort of community feel, maybe. Where they can be a little bit more flexible on pricing and things, so they might do more offers, they might still talk to these people in a sense of exclusive communications, but it is still very much more people can be a part of this, and it can be a lot more product led as well.
One thing that a couple of things that immediately occur to me. One is, if you are an expensive brand and you feel boxed in by that, please don't think that the answer is just to reduce your prices, because particularly for the really premium, really luxury brands, that can actually destroy the business. You do get this phenomenon where some of the really premium luxury brands are what economists call Veblen goods, which means that they have, unlike almost all other goods and services, they have a positive price elasticity. That is to say, the more you put prices up, the more you sell. It's very unusual, but it can happen. And if you are in the lucky position to be one of those brands, if you make the mistake of discounting, your business unravels. The other thing is that even if you're a very exclusive luxury brand, it may be important to advertise quite broadly. In fact, it may be important to advertise to people who can't afford you. Because what you're doing, and this is, it may be quite odious, but what you're doing is signaling what this brand stands for. Because one of the reasons people buy luxury brands is to signal their social status. And it's important that everyone knows what they stand for. So, for example, we did, in my advertising agency that I worked for years ago, we did advertising for Bentley cars. Bentley have become a bit more ubiquitous now. They have, they're a bigger brand than they were. But back then, very, very few people could afford to buy Bentley. And yet we did mass advertising for them, admittedly in magazines like The Economist and stuff like that. And the ads explicitly said things like, "Turn the page, young man," as in, you can't afford this product. Because it was important for people who couldn't afford to buy Bentleys to know, as the Bentley rolled by, just how expensive they were.
And you're really building up with that particular ad. You're building up the ego of the person who can afford that, who isn't the young man and doesn't need to turn the page.
That's precisely the point. So that the person who can afford to buy a Bentley feels better about having it. Well, better in some sense. And also that the young man who can't afford it will maybe 30 years later go, finally, I can afford a Bentley.
Yeah, it plants the seed of aspiration early. And it feels like cars are actually one of those brands you were talking about, that a luxury car anyway, that no matter what you raise the price to, there's still going to be demand for Bentleys, for high-end Lamborghinis, things like that. Like there's a certain class of people that are going to want to buy that car because of what it represents. And you reach them with broad advertising, not an ad in Billionaires Quarterly. Okay, so the final brand scenario that we are talking about is a little bit of a sad one. It makes me sad to talk about these, but they're the underinvested brands, the brands that have been, maybe put on the shelf for a bit. Growth has stagnated. Maybe they've focused too much on promotional advertising for too long, less, as you indicated before. So I think first and foremost is, how do you know if you're an underinvested brand? I think some people might not even realize it.
One way I think about it is by a process of elimination. You're not new, you're not constrained by niche or category or market or capacity. You're not at an exclusive price point. So that, leaves possibilities. Either, you've got a terrible product. That can be a problem. Have you got the distribution? Presumably if you've been around for a while, you'll have tried to sort that out. You've optimized your price. If all those things are okay, the only other possible explanation is that you're either not spending enough on marketing communications, or your marketing communications are rubbish. And often the biggest problem there is underinvestment. In fact, when people come to me with a problem like that, almost my first assumption is, well, you're just not spending enough money. I think partly that comes from, things like not understanding that you need, as I said right at the beginning, that you need to keep increasing the budget in line with or ahead of your sales in order to grow. And some of those brands, if you simply do increase the budget, you kickstart growth again. So if you need convincing, use various forms of analysis like advertising to sales ratios, share of voice analysis, market mix modeling. Those things can tell you how much to spend. Do experiments, try increasing the budget in a test region or in a test market or a test category. However, some firms may not have the budget. It may not be possible to get the budget to spend more. In which case, maybe the route out is to be acquired by a bigger company that has the budget. That's often how you see dusty old brands come back to life, as some bigger company buys them up and puts money back into them again. But, ultimately, someone has got to spend some money.
And you've one of the ways that you've talked about in some other work that you've written is share of search and its
Yes.
correlation to share of voice and market share and things like that. Is that a good way for brands to sort of understand if their market share is shrinking and
Yeah.
again looking at that compared to how much they're spending? Is that like
Yeah.
that feels like an accessible way?
Yes, exactly. One problem that smaller brands and smaller companies have is they don't have so big research budgets. They may not be able to afford market mix modeling. They may not have access to, data on competitors' spending and so on. But share of search analysis is very affordable and very simple. The idea is basically you look up at what people are Googling. You look at the number of people that are Googling your brand. So you can get that data actually for free from Google Trends. And then look at how many people are Googling your competitors. And then basically create a sort of share of organic searches. Look at your share of all the organic brand searches in your category. And that gives you an idea of basically your share of, if you like, share of mind, the extent to which people are thinking about your brand and looking for your brand when they first sort of start out. It's quite a different approach from looking at, if you like, the response to paid search advertising. It's about looking at how many people are coming in at the top of the marketing funnel. And what we tend to find is that share of organic search queries is often a predictor of share of market, share of sales. So that could be one way of interrogating, are you getting enough demand at the top of the funnel to make your brand grow?
And Emily, I imagine that many of your clients are coming to you in this sort of moment where they maybe hit a wall or they've stagnated for a bit. What are the tools at your disposal to sort of get a brand out of this rut that they might be in?
Yeah, it's a really difficult place to be in. And, a lot of the stuff of what I do is really kind of holding the brand's hand and, helping them make the right decisions essentially. And one thing that, is a good way to sort of tackle this, obviously for brands who have some level of investment, is to really, invest in the tech that you have that can be generating revenue or helping you with leads in the background. So, platforms like MailChimp, where you can automate workflows that push users along the journey, push them closer to the point of conversion. That's all once set up, and there is kind of that front-weighted cost of time where you have to get it all set up, but then that's going to be working in the background for you. So having tech that can do that and investing in the right tech for the business will help you get there. But as I say, that is really only for the brands that have some level of investment, because some don't actually have that either.
And I think one thing that we haven't really talked about very much is the way in which brand advertising, broad reach brand advertising, interacts with performance channels. There is, you mustn't neglect the role for the broader reach channels, including legacy media like outdoor or TV or those other things, because that stuff can help get people on the purchase journey. They can get people searching for the brand, and then when you do hit them with things like SMS and email, they're much more likely to respond to that stuff, and much more likely to open emails, click on links, be warmly disposed towards all that stuff if you've already warmed them up with those other channels as well. So I think this is really important to think about the way in which all the channels all work together. Brand media make activation media work harder. Activation media make brand channels more immediately profitable.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
definitely.
think
It's almost
oh,
like a halo effect. And
Absolutely.
email and
Yeah,
SMS can't work as well as they could unless all the other channels are also doing their part.
absolutely.
I think one of the things we see too is while it's not, it's more difficult to calculate the ROI of something like an outdoor ad than it
Yeah,
is email or SMS, obviously. But to your point, they are working together in a way that, you know, the ROI calculation shouldn't be the end all be all decision maker of whether or not you do something. Um, and Emily, I'm curious to see how your clients compare too. We see a lot of our small businesses, especially the very small ones, like Les, I can't imagine seeing a billboard for Bennett Consulting anytime soon. Maybe, but it might not be the best use of your money.
I've actually seen a mocked up one.
Oh, have you? There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we see a lot of our customers, a lot of our small businesses, they'll use email and SMS. I think they get a sort of stereotype as being transactional and being performance based. They're great at doing that. But they can also build a brand. And Emily, I'm curious how you balance that with your clients, or what you see some of the small businesses you work with, how they balance brand and performance using those specific channels.
Yeah, I suppose, a balance is really important because at the end of the day, you need the channels to be making you money. And a lot of the time, that is through kind of pushing products or services and things like that. But also, it's really important not to forget how important it is to get people to buy into the brand. So,
Yeah.
when people first sign up, you want them to feel really excited. They're going to be expecting an email or an SMS, depending what they've signed up to, hit their phone. And they don't want to be pushed a product straight away. They want to know about the brand. They want to be a part of it. They want to understand the value proposition and what it means to be a part of the brand. So there's a time and a place for both types of communications. It's just really making sure that you're hitting the right message at the right time.
And it's really important to go back to the thing that you said yourself, Emily, earlier on about brand building is about emotional connection. And it's not about direct response. It's about warming people up so that they will respond later when they're ready. So there's a couple of dangers there. One is when you try to do brand building with those sorts of channels, you will see low response rates. And that's to be expected. You're not doing a direct response job. What you're trying to do is to create feelings and memories which will affect sales later on. The other danger is all communications will have an emotional impact, regardless of whether or not you intended them to. And often in performance marketing, that's ignored. So, let's face it, a lot of performance marketing goes to people who are not ready to respond. And for those people, it can be actually spam, So this is the danger, is that if you hit people too often when they're not in the market, then there will be negative emotional connotations, which you're not necessarily measuring. So I would recommend that all businesses think about the long and the short term, the rational and the emotional, the functional and the brand aspects of all their communication.
I want to thank Les and Emily for their time answering all of my questions, and we're now going to pivot to answering some of yours. So let's open up the Q&A.
And we're back live. Thanks again to Les and Emily for the great chat there. Like I said, we want to hear from you now, though. So if you haven't already, please submit your questions via the Q&A tab in Goldcast. It looks like we've already got a ton of great ones in the queue. So we're actually going to extend this session by 15 additional minutes to give Les and Emily time to answer as many as they can. If you do have to sign off, that's okay. Don't worry. The full Q&A will be included when we post this video on demand. So let's just jump right into our first question, Les and Emily, if you are ready to go. We had a first question that is, what is our the biggest misconception that small brands have about growth?
Okay. I think it's hard to say exactly what the biggest ones are, but I think there are two that are quite common. One is that you can grow through an intense having an intense loyalty through a small number of customers who just are absolutely passionate about you, and we know empirically that that's just false. The main driver of growth is not the strength of the attachment, not the loyalty that people have to your brand, but the size of the customer base. And in fact, small brands tend to have weaker loyalty than bigger ones. So that loyalty myth is really important to nail. And then that might well be the most important misconception. But the second one is that all you need is performance marketing. Yes, when you first start, it's a really important driver, but don't neglect brand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Les. And I'd say another one is not forgetting about the marketing. You can have a really great product, but really you need that marketing built around it that is going to really amplify that product as well. So it's not just about the product, but also about everything, the marketing that sits with it to amplify the brand, amplify the product values and everything like that as well.
And we've got another question, less directed towards you, I believe, because it's mentioning the long and the short of it, something you wrote a few years ago. So with the long and the short of it and the 60-40 heuristic in mind, how do you manage the change from a sales activation heavy mix to a more balanced sales activation and brand communications mix?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as small brands begin to grow, that becomes more and more important. When, particularly if you're a new brand, yeah, you do want to go activation heavy, but after a while, you reach a sort of inflection point where you need to start dialing up the brand communication. How you manage that actually is quite interesting, and I don't have a complete answer, but I think the first thing is because it's a sort of cultural shift as much as anything else. It's understanding that brand communications, brand building communications, they are about generating cash. They're not, frivolous. They're not a waste of money. They're not a luxury. They are about, stimulating your cash flow and increasing your margins, but they take longer to have their full effect. So it means shifting from a very immediate, very direct approach to payback to a longer term one. It means changing the things you measure to some extent, not just looking at the immediate short-term responses, like, the clicks and likes and conversion ratios, but looking at the base level of sales and looking over longer time periods, and thinking about things financially in terms of payback over sort of from sort of the quarter onwards, rather than this week or just within this quarter.
And we have another question here that says, when you say that we can start off performance heavy, I assume we is smaller brands. So when smaller brands can start performance heavy, what signals should we be watching for or looking for that it's no longer working and it's time to shift focus to brand? Is it something like, a rising customer acquisition cost, or what are your indicators there, Les and Emily?
Yeah, looking at rising acquisition costs, looking at falling conversion rates would be one of the things you do. I mean, basically what tends to happen is in the early days when a brand first launches, you get, very rapid growth. You might even get exponentially, like a rising exponential growth curve. What tends to happen as you reach that, what some people have called the performance plateau. Grace Kite and Tom Roach talk about the performance plateau. What tends to happen is growth begins to slow down. The exponential curve begins to look more like an S-shaped curve. You start to see falling conversion rates, rising cost per acquisition, a slowdown in the rate of growth, and this very often can happen sort of, after you've, within a year or two of launch. And at that point, then you need to start asking, do we need other things to keep growth going, particularly when we're not on promotion, when we're not offering people deals? What's the base level of sales when we're not, giving people offers? I think at that point you need to then, when you're beginning to see effectively diminishing returns set into your performance marketing, that's when you need to start thinking about brand.
Emily, is there anything you'd add to that, like from a small business perspective, things that you see with your clients that indicate it's time to, switch off of a performance heavy sort of strategy?
Yeah, there's a time and a place for everything. There's a time where you should be pushing brand in your communications, and there's a time where you should be, really focusing on the performance side of things, the promotions, like Les said. And there's sort of key areas in a user's journey where those things should happen, really. So, when someone's just become aware of you, seeing where they've come from. Have they come from a sale? What sort of information they're going to need? Have they come organically when the sale's not really on? That's really when we'll be pushing kind of that brand messaging and things like that. So I think audiences can get very, tired of the same sort of performance-based messaging, and there are some customers that want to learn about the brand. They want to be part of the brand, feel like they are a piece of the brand. So yeah, there's a time and a place for all different types of communications.
Makes a ton of sense. Our next question is from somebody, I think they're building a small disruptor type brand, because they're referencing building one of those. What is your opinion, both of you, on directly naming the sort of bigger incumbent competitor in the category and highlighting your, unique selling propositions compared to them?
Ooh, yes. It is. Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer to this. It's risky. I mean, the minute you mention a competitor, you are effectively, to some extent, advertising them, aren't you? Also, there is a slight misunderstanding here. If you're talking about brand building communications, I think it's important to remember that they are primarily emotional, not rational. If you're doing activation, if you're doing performance marketing, then prices and offers and USPs, rational things are important. At the brand level, it's not primarily about rational messaging. So the idea that you do it by going, our prices are lower, our specifications are higher or whatever, is maybe a slight misunderstanding about how brand building works.
I think there's room too in a situation like that. It feels like the category is something that you can sort of push back against versus the actual bigger competitors in that category. If you're a small disrupting brand in a category, presuming you're doing something different in that category, and sort of just positioning that as the old way and you as the new way is an interesting. Casper didn't invent mattresses, right? But they changed the way that they were delivered. So there's something interesting to that as well, just like repositioning category players without naming them necessarily.
I mean, if you think about the famous Avis, it was Avis, wasn't it? We try
Number two.
harder.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't explicitly say who was number one, did they?
Right.
So one can do it without actually, doing advertising for your competitor. I have seen ads. So I think Sainsbury's in the UK did some ads. I don't think I'm imagining this. I think they did some ads saying that they were price matching Aldi, and I think that was a terrible mistake, because that's the big brand advertising the small one and saying how cheap they are. It's kind of like, not a good idea.
Let's get to this next question. Are there any are there any types of promotions or deals that are better suited to helping new brands get recognized by consumers?
Okay. I have a lot of skepticism about promotions and deals generally, as you know, probably. For many brands, they're quite damaging. New brands are slightly different because promotions can encourage trial. I mean, this is the point, is if you can get people to try a brand, brands grow primarily through acquiring new customers and expanding their customer base. So promotions that actually get people to try the product for the very first time have some value. I mean, for example, that could be, like, I don't know, a trial size of a product, or tastings, or the kind of thing where it's a relatively low cost way of getting someone introduced to the product for the very first time. But these can go wrong. I saw an example years ago where it was actually an established brand launching a new product, and they did a thing where they distributed samples of the product to households in the UK. But the samples were huge. I mean, weeks and weeks worth of the product, and it actually depressed the entire market for about 6 months. I mean, that's really dumb. So sampling, basically, but so many companies think that the way to acquire customers is to give your stuff away for free or to give very, very generous discounts. And that can be quite risky because you've then anchored people in. Yes, you've got a few new customers, but you've anchored people in at a very low price point that's not going to be profitable for you. And all too often, those people are not genuinely new customers at all.
Yeah, just to develop on with that, there are some brands that, promotions can work well for, but it's really important that you don't fall into the trap of being one of those brands that has to push promotions all day, every day in order to make any sort of sale. And, some brands do this really well. If I think about, Gusto or HelloFresh, that are sort of subscription services that offer deals to acquire new customers, but then they might have deals further down the line, 30% off your next 3 orders, really trying to get people on board with their product and the quality of their product and how it tastes. And there are some really, nice promotions that work quite well in that sort of industry. But yeah, it's just making sure that you don't fall into the trap, I guess, of being a discount brand, which works for some, but it doesn't work for all.
It sounds like it depends on the category too. If you're talking about HelloFresh is a completely new model. People might not trust food being delivered to their door. You need to hook them with a 30-day free trial before they're willing to pay for that.
And also, I think about the competition. So when Uber entered the London market, I think it's true that at that point there were no other ride-hailing services like Uber. We didn't have, for example, Lyft and Bolt and all the other things that came after. So at that point, you were getting people to try online, online ride hailing for the first time. It was effectively launching the category. So they did a promotion in London, which was like, you sign up, you get an immediate sort of, I don't know, I think it was quite generous. It was like 20 quid's worth of free, maybe 10 quid's worth of free ride, and 10 more if you recommended someone else. I mean, that really worked because people tried it and they went, wow, this is amazing, and there's nothing else like it. Contrast that with a couple of Christmases ago, there was this big wave of companies doing immediate online grocery delivery, the sort of guerrilla, I can't remember what they were all called, a bunch of them all launching this thing where you could get your groceries sent to you within half an hour by a guy on a scooter, all at Christmas time. So, I mean, personally, I signed up for all of them because they were all giving you, what it was, 20 quid or something of groceries. So I got about 100 quid's worth of my Christmas shopping for free instantly, never used any of them again. And part of that was actually this is a service that was not particularly useful. How often do you really need to pay over the odds for a bottle of wine within 15 minutes? Secondly, there were so many of them that actually none of them could lock in the way that Uber did.
Well, I think that's about the time we have for questions. So I want to thank all of you, our audience, for being here with us, taking the time to listen. And thank you again to Les and Emily for sharing a ton of great information on how to grow small brands. As a reminder, you can download this report that we discussed today from the Docs tab in Goldcast, or any of our other thought leadership reports by visiting MailChimp.com. And to our audience members, if you have time, we would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to do a quick survey. It'll pop up in your browser here on Goldcast, or coming straight to your inbox afterwards. And that's about our time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.